interview with Richard Arndt by William took place in Washington, D.C. on May 9, 1988. The interview is part of a joint project by the Columbia University Oral History Research Office and the Foundation for Iranian Studies. Dr. Arndt, can you tell me something about your early background, such as where you were born and raised?
I was born in Philadelphia and raised in northern New Jersey. I went to high school in Englewood, New Jersey, and was a scholarship student at Princeton. I got there in 1945 when the GIs were still on the campus. Graduated in February '49. Knocked around for a while. I majored in French literature, by the way. That's part of the theme here. Knocked around for a while, worked on the Bergen Evening Record in Hackensack, New Jersey. And in fall of '49, went off to France on a Fulbright, the first year of Fulbright students in France. And that began my long-term love affair with France, which is part of the story of my relationship with Iran, because I actually rode in on that particular carpet. When I came back from France in 1950, the Korean War was on. I was declared 4F because I had asthma, and I decided to go back to graduate school, which I did. I couldn't afford it, so I worked nights in a garage and went to Columbia during the day, a couple times a week, and then began full-time at Columbia. That could have been that fall, 51, 52, I guess, yeah. Got my master's in French literature still in 1952. Went out and taught for a year in Pennsylvania. Married a friend from France, from Dijon, and came back to New York, to Columbia in 1953, and began teaching at Columbia University. And I taught at Columbia University until 1961. I got my doctorate in '59. I was assistant professor of French and Humanities. And in '61, in the Kennedy years, like many others, beguiled by the songs that John F. Kennedy was singing, I tried to join the government and managed to get into USIA. I was interviewed, had my panel on the 1st of March 1961, and swore in on the 26th of June 1961. Did a couple of months training and was sent to Beirut. And in Beirut, fresh out of Columbia University, not even 2 months, I functioned on the one side as a friend of the faculty on the American University, but more importantly, I was the first American in the embassy for years who's been able to handle French at the same level. My French is almost bilingual, by the way. In fact, it is bilingual. So I taught at the French university, and I did all kinds of things, and it was quite an interesting affair. And the link to the story here is that it was there that I met Ambassador Armin Meyer, who was my first ambassador. And he was very supportive and so forth. If I'm going too fast, you can stop me at this point.
Yeah. What led you to join USIA as opposed to some other government area?
Well, I was really into literature, the arts. I'd done my thesis on the 18th century. I was really a literature student, and it seemed to me that USIA had to do with cultural affairs and informational affairs. I didn't have much interest in diplomacy, surely, at the time. And I certainly didn't have anything. I was interested in foreign service. That's as simple as that.
How would you define the purpose of USIA at the time that you were at the mission in Lebanon?
Well, you got to watch out with questions like that, because right now I'm one of the people who's really becoming a historian of all that, so I could go on for hours. The USIA had always been an amalgam ever since the Second War of two different functions, which in most countries are separate, but in our country is together. On the one hand, the information, which is a euphemism for propaganda function, and on the other hand, the cultural affairs function. And when I got into the agency, we were in an interesting period. After the 50s, there had been a great deal of emphasis on the cultural function. By that I meant not only cultural exchanges, Fulbright program and that kind of thing, but libraries, English teaching, book programs, all kinds of things. Edward R. Murrow, who was one of the reasons that we all wanted to join USIA at that time, brought a different act to it. On the one hand, Murrow himself, who had been one of the officers of the Institute for International Education in the 30s, and who was a student of Shotwell at Columbia, who was a very sophisticated intellectual in his own way, had an understanding of the need for intellectual contact between the United States and the rest of the world. On the other hand, he had a deputy named Tom Sorensen, who was the brother of Ted Sorensen in the White House, whom he elevated to the number 3 position in the agency. And Tom Sorensen was probably responsible more than anyone else for using the language of the advertising world and for creating the notion of what we call target audiences, and targeting our shots and shaping the message. So that on the one hand, Murrow brought an increased appreciation of the integrity of the intellectual world and intellectual connections between nations. And on the other hand, he brought in a man who probably more than anybody else refined, to be kind, the propaganda art down to a much more narrow focus than it had ever had before, and made it increasingly, I think, planted the seeds for a great deal more dissension that emerged later, particularly with regard to, I can remember him saying that libraries were nothing but carrots. You brought people into the library with the carrot of the books, and then when you got them in there, you hit them over the head with the message, with the stick. I remember thinking that was a pretty crude way to put it, to say the least. But in any case, in Lebanon, I never did quite figure out what our mission in Lebanon was. I was an assistant cultural attaché, and I had succeeded a man who had built a reputation, I think quite unfairly, as a contact with youth in the country. And I don't think it was all that kind of as good a job. So I really developed I followed on that in the first place, and what that meant was that I was in contact with youth at the level of universities. In other words, I spent a great deal of time trying to figure out what the universities were doing and what kind of people were going to the universities, what kind of training they were getting, and what kind of work was going on there. On the second hand, I had a highly personal mission, only because I was the only person who could do it, to build bridges to the French community. As you know, the Maronites were all educated by the French for the most part in Lebanon, and the AUB tended to focus on the others to some extent. So I was really building bridges, and we did a lot of that kind of thing. So Lebanon, after all, in 61 to 63, when I was there, was 4 or 5 years away from the Marine levies of 58. It was a time when we were trying to convince Lebanon that it could be a peaceful, a bastion of peace and a hinge of stability in the Middle East. It was a time when a viable Lebanon seemed a reality. An ironic thought nowadays, but there it was. And we used to say at that time that Lebanon would be the second country to recognize Israel. All someone else had to do would be open the door, and then Lebanon would follow. Well, it didn't turn out that way. But in any case, it was very peaceful times, and I developed a very close relationship to the Lebanese and to the French side in particular, such that when I was transferred to Sri Lanka against my will in 1963, Armin Meyer submitted a dissent cable stressing that very peculiar knack I had for relating to the French Lebanese who ran the country after all, saying that sending Dick Arndt to Sri Lanka is like sending Mickey Mantle to the plate without his bat. I always thought, again, that was a rather crude metaphor, but it in all modesty pointed out the fact that I had a really unique mission in the country that no one probably could have followed. It was, in a way, it was just throwing the mission away. But our overall mission, it seemed to me, as I look back on it, was just kind of maintaining stability, trying to convince the Lebanese that we were their friends, that our friendship with Israel was not excessive, and that there was balance in the relationship. Even-handedness, I guess we would have called it later. And I think we were trying to build a more stable Lebanon as a centerpiece, or not a centerpiece, a cornerstone, perhaps a small cornerstone, before our presence in the Middle East.
Interesting. Who, by the way, was the attaché, the cultural attaché? That you're the deputy?
His assistant, a guy named Russell Lynch, L-I-N-C-H, who's retired now, living in Monterey, who later succeeded me in Tehran, as a matter of fact.
Your next stop, why did you leave for Sri Lanka?
Sri Lanka was called Ceylon in those days. I left in August of '63. I think I got there around the 6th, if I'm not mistaken, of August. And took up, I did 3 years residence in Sri Lanka, which again was a success. It was a very successful situation. I was cultural attaché now. I had a Fulbright commission to deal with. I had it was a small country, 11 million at the time, where if you got in an airplane high enough, you could see the whole country. A lot bigger than Lebanon, but at least I had responsibility for a total cultural program, small as it was, which I suppose was my initiation to the politics of culture. I think more there than in Sri Lanka, I realized that education, higher education particularly, had an enormous political impact on the nature of that society, and that the plug-in, as far as I was concerned, of my work was essentially cultural, and that fed into the education community. I think I saw in that country that higher education was an enormous political tool that the U.S. had the means to relate to in some detail, and to shape in ways that were useful to future relations between the two countries, and certainly useful to U.S. foreign interests. I also got interested at that particular point, and I think this is a prelude to my going to Iran. I got interested in the notion of manpower economics as the link between cultural affairs and educational development in the developing countries. When you looked at the kind of work that we could do with the Sri Lankan universities, it was developmental, and in order to make decisions about what you would do, it was important to know what the country needed, say, in terms of manpower. It was if you could invest in a chemistry department, let's say, at the University of Sri Lanka, was that a better thing to do than a journalism department, and so forth. So it got me interested in manpower economics, and that was an extremely good preparation for Iran. But it was the first time that I thought of a single country as a political economic unit to which American cultural relations could make some kind of a contribution in developmental terms, and that contribution then could become part of the U.S. relationship pattern with that country that would reflect in the long run on U.S. national interests. So in '66 I was transferred to Tehran. It's probably worth noting that I had been in Iran very briefly in the January of '62. Maybe it was '63. No. Well, I can tell you why it happened. The Robert Joffrey Ballet came to Beirut, and I was with them for the better part of 10 days. It was over New Year's, I remember that. And they went on to Tehran, and when they got to Tehran, the company got together and bought me a round-trip ticket to bring me on to Tehran to be with them because they missed me, as it were. So I went to Tehran, and I went down to Shiraz and went to Isfahan. I looked around. The cultural attaché at that time, Ted Wertheim, who has since died, was a very powerful and very wonderful man. And we went hiking in the mountains. We did a lot of things, but it was there that I really picked up a feeling for Iran that was quite unusual. I mean, I had a sense that this was a very mysteriously beguiling place, and it had some kind of rapport with me. I wasn't sure what it was. I remember I went to Shiraz by myself and went out to Persepolis, and I had been instructed by a friend in Beirut that the way to see Persepolis was by moonlight. It happened to be a full moon. So I stayed in the hotel over at the Persepolis and snuck out into the monument at night by moonlight. And it's one of those deathless memories that But Iran will always have a very mysterious and haunting and beautiful quality for me. And so that when I went there in '66, contrary to many Americans who went there with, I would say, anger, resentment, disdain, and so forth, I already had a kind of a love for the country, which I think transpired in everything I did. And I think I approached Iran with a great sense of wonder.
Was your assignment to Iran '66 by choice? Was it a matter of your choice, or you moved there, as it were?
Well, it's a funny question. I was getting tired of Sri Lanka, for sure. And I asked one of my friends in Washington to get me out of there. As a matter of fact, I remember saying, even if I have to go to Vietnam, can you imagine? That was in '66, and things in Vietnam were relatively calm, and I thought maybe there was a cultural job to be done in Vietnam. Well, as it turned out, when the way the chips fell, what they needed was someone in Iran. They had a lot of trouble with the post for various reasons, and they were trying to build a more positive-oriented team. And so I was the first new member of that team. The PAO's name was Larry Hall, H-A-L-L, and he just needed some help to put down what was a fairly unruly bunch of officers. And Armin had suggested me, I guess, and so it was against my will, but it was a matter of, I remember when it hit, when I got the news, I was stunned by the appropriateness of it. It somehow seemed like exactly the right place for me at that time. It was a step, by the way, upwards. It was a major CAO post where I had been only in two very small places before that.
Now, before you moved to the country, did you receive any special training on Iran?
Zero.
Yeah.
It's as simple as that. Zero.
Yeah.
Nothing to add.
Yeah. Now,
in fact, I flew exactly from Colombo. Did I overnight in Bombay? I don't think so. I flew directly from Colombo through Bombay. I guess I had a 4-hour, 5-hour layover in Bombay. And then I went on to Colombo, arrived there late at night, without a visa, can you imagine? So, all things considered, I had absolutely no training at all. Okay. I arrived in August of '66. Again, it seems to me it was around the 4th, 5th, or 6th, I don't remember.
Before I get to some of the kind of questions about your activities in Iran, I have some general questions about your impressions of the country. What impressions did you get of Iran during your first few years there?
Well,
how did you form, I guess, during...
I don't know how you answer a question like that. I mean, I suppose what you probably want to know more than anything else is what political impressions I had. I certainly had an impression that economically it was a country with enormous, overwhelming problems, but that they were trying to do something about them, as far as I could see, that they were pulling together more or less and trying to solve it. The society that I saw was a complex thing to talk about, but reminded me a little bit of Lebanon. Certainly the upper class reminded me of the Lebanese, although in many ways better educated and better, and in many ways certainly more intelligently realistic. But I think the interesting part, the universities were in terrible shape, the press was in terrible shape. I mean, there were just an enormous amount of problems, but I had a real sense that people were getting ready to do something about it. Early impressions politically were really, I think, symbolized by a rally that I went to in the great stadium with a man named Chuck Rassius, whom you should interview, and Larry Samakas, if I'm not mistaken. And we went to this rally, and there was this green and red and white flag, and these masses of people performing folk dances or whatever they were doing, marching up and down. And we were just all stunned by the fact that it was like a Mussolini rally. So that I had that sense of an enormous mobilization of the masses that was, on the one hand, impressive, on the other hand, very dangerous in a country that had really no tradition of this kind of thing. So that there was that constant sense of what you might call threat or menace, having to do with the enormous numbers of people and the enormous numbers of illiterates. The literacy level when I got there was something on the order of 25%. and the unmobilized resources of the country. And on the other hand, the notion that you could mobilize them fairly easily, probably with money, and get them to do quite amazing things. So on the one hand it was threat, on the other hand it seemed like an enormous human resource power of something that could be achieved. The other impression I had was that our relationship, the U.S. relationship with Iran at that time, was very special. And let me say a couple of words about that. My understanding now, and I think that's what I was being fed at the time, went something like this. We didn't talk about the Mossadegh reversal in '53, except in sort of elusive terms. We were obviously trying to forget that. The impression I had from people, none of this was written, none of this was documented, but some people who'd been there in the 50s and some people who even were serving with me, particularly a man named Sterling Steele, who lives out in California now, he's retired, and who you ought to get out if you can. He's really a very voluble, articulate man. Well, the impression I had was that after the reversal of Mossadegh, we had really played not only a strong role, but almost a total role, that we were a tutelary power. And that rather interesting experiment, which involved the collusion of great empires like the Ford Foundation and others, that it was really in many ways a total effort to get the country straightened out. After all, there was a long history of American advice going back to Morgan Schuster in the teens and Millspaw in his two missions later on to straighten out Iran economically. And whatever followed, always the stress, of course, was on economics, the assumption that politics and social development would follow that. I think that's now a flaw as I look back on it, but we were certainly oriented to developing the economy, and the assumption was the rest would follow. In any case, it seemed to me in 66 when I got there, that we were at a very crucial point in our relationship with Iran, that we had decided to stop this tutelary power and to persuade Iran that it was to be a sovereign state and that we would be partners. We would no longer be their tutors. The symbol of this to me was the phasing out of the aid mission, which, if I recall correctly, took place in the spring of '67, very shortly after I got there. I was in on the phase down of it, and in fact there were 2 or 3 little programs and 2 staffers from the aid mission that remained afterwards who were transferred to my office. It's quite unique. It's never happened in USIA history, and it caused a lot of eyebrow raising, but what it gave me was a certain additional dimension to my educational focus that was very powerful. But the key thing was to me that we were in a period, as I saw it, of saying to Iran, we are no longer your tutors, you're on your own, you're going to have to hack it yourselves, we're here to help in every way we can. We have limited resources, but we mean to be of assistance. We mean to be partners with you as a sovereign nation. And my sense was they've been saying this for some time, I thought, a couple of years maybe. Probably flowed out of the Kennedy period, but that the Iranians hadn't believed it. Well, my sense was in '66 and surely in '67 that they did believe it, and that suddenly there was this moment when the 2 of us had everything to do, every profit, everything to be gained from working together as sovereign partners, and that was, of course, the hallmark of the time that I spent there. And I spent 4 of my 5 years, in that frame of reference, that we were sovereign partners, that whatever thing we could bring to bear would find some usefulness. If they needed advice, they would, more often than not, come to me. And they would say, what do you know about, let's say, labor economics? And I would say, well, I don't know anything about labor economics, but I sure can find somebody who does. And they would say, well, why don't you bring somebody out and we'll see if we can find a way to program that person. And so I had a sense of in the years I was there, of relevance, of usefulness, of participating in the growth of that country that was really absolutely unique. I suppose, as I look back on it, there was some self-deception involved in that, some. but not all that much, as a matter of fact. It was a very peculiar thing. And while I didn't pinpoint in my mind the notion that economic development could not exist in a vacuum without social development and political development, it was perfectly obvious to me and to everybody around me, to the political section for sure, that there were political flaws which had to be overcome if the country was to be viable in the long run. One thing, for example, was information flow. We all believed that there was no way in the world that information flow could be repressed to the degree it was without putting the country in the grips of obscurantism, of ignorance, of uninformed decision-making, of non-fact-based work, decisions of any kind. And the result was that we really felt, and I think we all felt, that the Shah could loosen up a little bit. And in fact, during the 4 years, the first 4 years I was there, the newspapers gradually began to print a little bit more information. Not much, but enough that you could really see it from time to time. Beginning to loosen up. It's partly also, I think, we learned how to read the newspapers more closely, and we see the messages that had always been there under the lines. So that to sum that all up, the impression I had was of an enormous opportunity for these two countries to work together for the joint national interests.
I had the impression that around this time the Shah himself was beginning to resent a little bit the former tutelary relationship you described. Did you get that impression to any extent?
When I got there, before I left Sri Lanka, I had met a friend, to be honest, a CIA friend, whom I'd known before. I'd known him in Beirut. And he gave me a little bit of a briefing, not very much. We spent about an hour together. We had lunch, I guess. And he'd reminded me of something that had happened just before I got there. It was in the papers. There was a reporter for the New York Times named Tom Brady, who had printed a story about F4s or F5s, whatever they were then. We were up to 5 or 6, as I recall. And the defense of the island where they'd installed all the oil stuff down in the Gulf. They concentrated all their oil distribution center on one particular island, and the Iranians were terrified, recognizing that any Air Force in the area could be there in 3 minutes. And the Shah was arguing that he needed these very powerful jets to defend himself. And the reaction had been from the Americans, and this is why I always give credit to Arndt for resisting this, was not on your life. You can't absorb them, you don't need them. There are other ways to defend that island and the oil installations. Your security is not threatened, and we're not going to give you those planes. And so that we were resisting very, very heavily. I think that was resented by the Shah. The Shah expected us to give him everything he wanted. And it was natural for him to expect that. It was also natural for the Americans, for people like Armin Meyer anyway, to say, no, Your Majesty, we do not believe you can properly absorb that. You will recall that there had been a military mission survey back in the early 60s, I think 62 if I'm not mistaken, maybe 61, led by General Twitchell and having people like Alexander Haig and Kennedy on it. Did you know Haig was a mission? Remember that mission?
No.
And the guy that Richard Kennedy was his name, who was Under Secretary of Administration under Haig, were also on that team. And that had counseled, as I understand it from General Twitchell, very great restraint based on the absorptive capacity of the Iranian military. Well, by the time the 66 came along, Meyer was marching to that drummer. He was for sure restraining the Shah's natural instinct to want the moon and the stars. And that seemed to me to be an absolutely correct thing. Now, the Shah's resentment took the form of playing footsie with the Soviets. And the Soviets at that time had sold them, I don't know what, trucks, as I recall. They were military trucks.
Yeah.
And the Shah was using that as a threat. In other words, he was playing us off with the Soviets. Well, what else is new? I mean, that's a standard tactic. And I didn't have the impression at all that the Shah had any resentment whatsoever. I think the Shah, to the contrary, was very grateful for having put him on the throne and having affirmed our support of him. I think there was some question at that point about behavior during the Kennedy period. There was some question of whether the Kennedy people had not pushed the notion of liberalization a little bit hard, a little bit too fast for the Shah's judgment. But that, during our time, was not going on. We were really, I think, pacing it more or less as he wanted it. And except in the military, I think he wanted to go faster than we did. But otherwise, I think we were doing what we could. I don't think he even resented the phase out of the aid mission. There was the usual grumbling, but I think it was understood that it was a natural thing for us to do at this particular point. And of course, we played it like it was a great compliment that Iran had graduated from high school and now it could go on its own, blah blah blah, that kind of stuff. Part of our information side's mission was to stress that theme that Iran was a developing country, it was moving rapidly and so forth. When I got there, by the way, the per capita income in Iran was something on the order of $300 a year. It's pretty low. But when I left it was moving. It moved up rapidly, and it kept moving, of course, until the bust. So that resentment is not a word I would use at all. I think the Shah was beginning to see that he could not rely on the Americans quite the way he had, and he was beginning to cope with that. He was beginning to understand that there were other countries in the world who might be helpful. The Germans were moving in. The French were there, of course, had always been there. British in their small way. But I think the Shah also saw the need to maintain better relations with his neighbors than perhaps he'd been aware of before. But all that said, there wasn't really, I would never use the word resentment.
Uh-huh. Did you ever meet him, by the way, the Shah?
Yeah. I met him. I shook his hand several times and smiled at him and probably mumbled a few words, but was never anything more than that.
Yeah.
My wife knew the Empress pretty well. Well, I say knew her. Had several long meetings with her in which they got really down to brass tacks. I should tell you now that I had a deputy as cultural officer in 1967 who later became the director of the Iran-America Society, and in 1973 we were married. And so I speak to some extent for her as well, because we maintained very close contact while she was my deputy. She was the perfect deputy, and everything I knew she knew, and vice versa. So I sometimes will speak for something that she told me, but she, in any case, had several long interviews with the Empress. And we were also in touch with a lot of advisors of the Empress. The Empress had a little think tank of her own, a little intellectual team, many of whom are in this city right now, and who used to give her very thoughtful advice, and we knew most of those people and always knew that if we had something that needed to be said, we could probably find a way to say it.
Based upon your impression and maybe the reports that you read and what people told you, what was your assessment of the Shah? How would you characterize him what was your reading of him, I guess?
Well, first of all, I thought they were very lucky to have him when you consider the alternatives. When you looked around you and you saw, say, Abdel Nasser over in Egypt, and nobody worth mentioning in Iraq, and chaos in Afghanistan, and no real leader within sight, the Shah looked like a pretty stable guy. So there was that. And I want to stress that because the rest of what I'm going to say is going to sound negative. But I want to stress the fact that he was in many ways, a colossal figure. He certainly meant well. Whether he was as wise as he should have been at that particular time, or above all, whether he was as profound in seeing the interconnections of things, is another question. That's, I think, where there was weakness. I never thought of him as a strong man. I thought of him always as a man who would puff himself up to look strong as he could. He wasn't tall, as you know, but he would always rise to his full height and throw his shoulders back. And I can only tell you a marvelous story that I don't see does any harm. It's a very touching story told to me by an American portrait painter who was invited to Iran, or sent out, I recall. As I recall, it was a gift from Time magazine, as a matter of fact. As a matter of fact, I remember his name. His name was Bill Draper. And Draper had a few seances or meetings with the Shah in which he asked him how he wanted to pose. And the Shah explained to him that he was the father of his people and that he wanted to look very fatherly. So the painter asked him to take a pose, and he took an enormously rigid pose with one arm on one arm of the chair, the other arm on the other arm of the chair, and with his most stern posture, looking, tense. And the painter asked him if he thought that was the way a father looked, and he said, yes, that's the way the father of his people must look. So he still wanted to get a little bit of relaxation, so he moved his arm around behind the chair so that somehow the pose seemed a little more casual. As he did, he noticed that the arm he was leaning on seemed very, almost distorted in its size. And he asked him, he said, Your Majesty, your arm seems to be larger than I would think an arm should be. And the Shah smiled with pride and said to him, yes, he said, I do it with barbells. Would you like to feel? Very touching, and I think that's the first element of negativeness that I would want to talk about. I mean, obviously, this was a young man who had grown up in the presence of a gigantic father. The old man, after all, had the power to serve his guests a cup of coffee, and they would die as soon as they walked out the door, and he did it frequently. He had the power of life and death over everybody, and he used it frequently. He was a towering man. Everybody was terrified of old Reza Shah, and I'm sure the son was too. The son was not big. He always tried to be as big as he could. He was adept at sports. I mean, that's to say, he spent a lot of time on sports. He used to play soccer. He flew fast planes, and he drove his cars. In fact, he was a womanizer in his early days. I mean, all these things trying to prove that he was more macho than his father. And it always struck me that it was those were signs of a very fundamental personality flaw in him, and that he always wanted to be as big as his father. And there was no way in the world he could accept the fact that he wasn't. I think that explains some of his marital problems. Who knows? I'm not a shrink, so I don't really know too much in detail. But there was a built-in weakness in him. Second thing is that his education had been seriously flawed. As my wife used to say, he didn't have the benefit of a democratic education. He had gone in the first place in Iran to I don't know how he started, but in any case, they sent him to a school in Switzerland, which was a kind of a secondary school for rich kids. And he got a little bit of taste of Swiss democracy, such as it is. I don't think it has any relationship to American democracy, but it was a tightly run little country, and he saw that, and he really saw a lot of things in Switzerland. He couldn't have been there more than a year or two. And then he came back, and they put him in the military academy. Now, the military academy in Iran, I had something to do with that later on, was a school of obedience. It was nothing more. You learned almost nothing in the military academy in Iran. And that's exactly what happened, so that this man's education was highly truncated. He further had, I don't know what exactly he had to do with the French, but his French was excellent. His whole family spoke, in some cases, better French than English. But he had this French thing, and my own feeling is that when the French educate somebody in the Middle East anyway, they're a little bit confused, because the French really do make their peace with monarchy a lot more easily than Americans do. There is a recognition of a certain kind of authoritarian democracy, guided democracy in France, than we would ever condone in our own thinking. And I always thought that was one of the political flaws in the Shah, that he'd been exposed to the French and the Swiss more than to the British or to the Americans, and that in a way that was unfortunate, but that was the person, of course, we were dealing with. So my impression of him was that he was a man trying to haul his country into the 21st century, or the 20th century for that matter, from the Middle Ages, And he was trying to do it very rapidly. And of course, at the time, I think every American in the mission thought he was doing it too slowly. If anything, we were simply impatient. That was the general mode of feeling of all the Americans in the embassy, myself included, that he really ought to get on with it faster. And as it turns out, I think we were wrong. As it turns out, I think he should have been much more cautious about the religious element, which we could talk about later, but to which we paid almost no attention at the time. The speed, the pace of development was monstrously fast. I remember every year Hoveda used to set the targets for national growth at really unrealistic phases, and then somehow or other they bring them in that way, although there was some question whether the statistics were honest and so forth. But there was a great deal of haste apparent in everything he wanted to do, and very little understanding for the fact that you cannot build democracy without a lot of Democrats, and that Democrats begin by being educated people. No doubt he was making a tremendous effort on literacy. But once again, the Shah believed that you could teach somebody to read and then not give him anything interesting to read and have it make a difference. The point is not to teach people to read, but to make people, help people read things that will help them grow and develop and learn. And that was something that he never simply understood, because the books that they had access to were simply not there. So reading was an irrelevant skill in many parts of the country, totally irrelevant and useless. So it was never much of a success. The big push for education came with the so-called University Revolution of 1968 or 8, I guess, which we can talk about in more detail when the time comes. But there was a genuine commitment to moving fast, too fast. My general impression at the time was that the man had weaknesses, that he was insufficiently profound in his perception of the interconnection of things, but that all things considered, he was very much pointed in the right direction.
Now, when you were stationed in Arndt, how much traveling around the country did you do?
I did a lot of traveling. I used to go out to the major cities all the time, and I usually would go out to lecture. I used to have a lot of slide lectures that I gave on different things about the United States that were attractive and that could get over the language gap. So I went regularly to Isfahan. I went regularly to Shiraz. I went to Tabriz a couple of times. I went to Mashhad a couple of times. I was out in, as I recall, Kermanshah. I used to drive out the countryside, the Qazvin, and up to the Caspian. We would go down to Kashan and down the desert mineral there. Did a lot of poking around by car, whatever we could. And down to the Gulf, of course. I went down to the Gulf more than once, too. I did as much traveling probably as anybody in the USIS mission.
Did you pick up much Farsi?
Well, I picked up a smattering of Arabic, and I used to have a woman come into my office about 3 times a week and try to help. But there were 2 problems with it. One was that I didn't really need it, because you have to remember that the generation educated in Iran, starting in 1925 and going through really until the 50s, had been educated in France. So not only the upper class, but the guidance, the people who were in charge, the elite, really knew French, and they knew it very well. And exactly as in Lebanon, there was no American who could compete with me in this regard. So I had this unusual access. And if I simply followed the normal things that seemed appropriate to do, I would have never used Persian at all. I wouldn't have needed it. Now, I'm linguistically curious and fairly adept, so I picked up a lot of Persian, but it's really phrases and so forth. And then I did a very fun trick. I learned a lot of poems, not a lot of poems. I learned a couple of dozen lines or stanzas of poetry, which the Iranians cared about enormously. But I used it sort of in a really Machiavellian kind of way. I had a poem for getting onto a platform and a poem for getting off of a platform, a poem for saying goodbye after a long evening, a poem for getting away early, you name it. I had a poem for every occasion.
Let me turn the tape over.